Hello everyone, and everybody, student, professor, faculties, and Professor Brown. Welcome to this second day of the Colloque of Beethoven in the Royal Conservatory of Brussels, Conservatoire Royal de Bruxelles, which we organized this year, a big festival organized by Miss Olivia Boinon de Oliveira. She is the head of librarian of this conservatory and also organology encyclopedia faculty. So I would like to thank everyone to be here. So you have the Zoom application and also a YouTube channel, which is the streaming of this session. So I would like to express my grateful to Mr. Professor Brown to having you today in the second day of this colloque. And I would like, if I may, introduce some words of your bibliography and your work in your life. So Professor Brown was a faculty in the University of Oxford and was studying history and then music at Cambridge and Oxford, where he took his doctor title in 1980 with a dissertation on the popularity and influence of sport in England. He was a member of the Faculty of Music at the University of Oxford between 1980 and 1999. Also, he was professor of applied musicology at the University of Leeds and is now emeritus professor. He currently gives an elective as guest professor at the Universität für Musik der Darstellenden Kunst in Vienna. His research has focused strongly on German music in the 19th century, and he has a special interest in historical performing practices. His book includes Louis Poe, a critical bibliography published in German Reviews edition in 2009, Classical and Romantic Performance Practice, 1970-90, and a portrait of Mendelssohn published in Yale in 2003. His critical performing practices editions of music include Brahms' Violin Concerto and his complete sonata for one instrument and piano, together with a text volume, Performance Practices, and in Johann Brahms' Chamber Music, and a new critical, historically informed performing edition of the solo parts of Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, together with the text volume, Performance Practices in the Violin Concerto, Opus 64, and Chamber Music of Strings in Bernreiter edition. So this session, if I may, Professor Brown, I just say a few words of your presentation, which the title is Between the Lines, so Entre les Lignes. And it's a presentation about the instrument and performing conventions of his own day. Both have changed simultaneously since his lifetime. Today we perform his music and modern instrumentals, as well as originals and copies and of the instruments with which he was familiar. So je vais juste le dire en quelques mots. En fait, Monsieur Brown va présenter quelques lignes de son ouvrage que j'ai cité récemment sur l'interprétation historique dans les œuvres de Beethoven, avec d'autres illustrations, comme par exemple les enregistrements du pianiste Reinecke qui ont été faits au début du XXe siècle, qui permettent un rapprochement historique entre la notation qui est écrite sur papier et évidemment l'interprétation historique que nous pouvons y attribuer en fonction des recherches musicologiques instrumentales avec les instruments d'époque ou les instruments modernes, et donc de faire un rapprochement entre la notation et l'interprétation historique des œuvres de Beethoven. So now, if I may, the stage is on you, Professor Brown.
Okay, good.
And thank you so much for coming here today for your presentation.
It's my pleasure. Glad to meet you all, even if only virtually. I want to cover a lot of ground in this talk, so I'm going to start straight away with a PowerPoint, which will make it easier, I think, for me to cover all the points that I want to deal with. So I will share my screen now and find the PowerPoint. Share computer sound, yes. And there we are. We start with a picture of Beethoven's funeral. Beethoven, of course, was to become an iconic figure over the 19th century and into the 20th century. But the question is whether we really understand what he meant by his notation. The big issue is that all of us who are alive today have grown up in traditions of musical performance that go no further back than the first half of the 20th century. What happened in the first half of the 20th century, the modernist revolution, we might call it, was a really radical affair. It wasn't just about creating new forms of art, it was about actively rejecting the old forms. So whatever threads of tradition have survived through the 19th century were actually consciously swept away by the modernists. And that's the tradition, essentially, that we've all accepted, not only in modern instrument performance, but also in period instrument performance, because the period instrument movement is a creation of the 20th century. So let's just have a look what some people said about these things. Some of the modernists, Karl Flesch, great developer of modern violin playing, he tells us in his Kunst des Violinspiels, 1923, that in the past decades, all the arts have undergone tremendous changes, so that it only seems natural if musical interpretation is influenced and adapted to contemporary feelings. When we read what Flesch writes about performance, we can see that he really did want to reject a great deal of what existed. Then we have van der Landowska saying that if Rameau would rise from his grave to demand of me some changes in my interpretation of his Dauphine, I would answer, you gave birth to it, it is beautiful, but now leave me alone with it. You have nothing more to say, go away. Tradition wasn't important to her. Arthur Schnabel, great Beethoven interpreter, according to the ideas of the 20th century, but he rejected all of the stylistic elements that had been inherited. He said, for instance, he wouldn't play with his hands apart. He would mock the hands apart style. He felt one could be equally expressive playing with hands together, and would say so with a twinkle in his eye. So the tradition wasn't important to him. It didn't matter whether Beethoven had played like that. That wasn't how we do it now. So one of the concepts that was very important in the early 19th century and the late 18th century was the idea of two kinds of performance. Richtiger Vortrag in German and schöner Vortrag. You see, I've highlighted them here in this example. They are often talked about in treatises of the early 19th century. This one is from 1804. Then there's Spohr in 1833. Hummel also talks about it, and many other musicians of the time, Czerny. What was Richtiger Vortrag? Richtiger Vortrag was essentially what we do today. That was playing the notes as they stand on the page as perfectly as possible. And we do this probably more beautifully than the people in the past ever could do it. But schöner Vortrag was not to be tackled until after you could do Richtiger Vortrag. But it was what the composer really wanted. Schöner Vortrag was all the extra things which went beyond the literal notation. I'll try to cover what some of those things were in the next hour. Here we have a treatise by August Eberhard Müller from the early part of the 19th century, which was also edited by Carl Czerny, Beethoven's pupil, in around 1830. And this is the passage from the 1830 revision. And he talks about Richtiger and schöner Vortrag, and says that in order to have schöner Vortrag, you have to have a knowledge of harmony, of figured bass. And he says it might be charitable to suppose that everybody has these feelings that can be developed so that you have beautiful performance. But he actually says, whoever does not possess them, it's not so. Who doesn't have them can never get further than mechanically correct performance, Richtiger Vortrag. And they might be useful as an orchestral player or as a choral singer, but they'll never be a soloist. Now, my PowerPoint seems to have stuck and doesn't want to go on. Let's try again. Here we are. Actually, it's slightly difficult for me with this PowerPoint because your images are all on the right-hand side of the screen, so I can't read some of my text here. So I might have to make bits of it up, but you'll be able to read it, I think, yourselves. You can probably see the whole screen. So what we have is Czerny here talking in 1846 about performing Beethoven's music. And he tells us how Beethoven was one of the great pianists of the day. He was as astonishing as Liszt and Thalberg are now in the 1840s. But his performances were always fickle. They were always different according to his moods. And then he tells us that even if it were possible to reproduce his way of playing exactly, it couldn't always act as a model. He means what he means here, because of what he says in the next bracket, that Beethoven didn't always play all the right notes. It wouldn't be satisfying to the people in the 1840s because it wasn't correct enough in terms of technique. But then he also says that even the spiritual conception has acquired a different validity through the changed taste of the times and must now be expressed by other means than were necessary in those days. So he's telling us that even in 20 years after Beethoven's death, things have changed in the way they are playing his music because taste changes. And that, of course, is absolutely true. It doesn't mean to say that it had changed very much at that point, but there were small changes all the time that were happening. And I want to look here just briefly at these changes that happened over time. Some of them happened quite early on. Some of them happened much later. So in the second quarter of the 19th century, in Czerny's own lifetime, we have a changing attitude towards what's the appropriate tempo for playing Beethoven's music. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then there's an increasing limitation of embellishment by adding notes to the text. In Beethoven's lifetime, it was absolutely normal to embellish all texts to some extent. And it depended on the tastefulness of the performer, how beautifully they might do it. Some people did it badly, some people did it beautifully. Some people didn't like it very much. Some people really thought it was very important. But this changed over the first quarter of the century, and it became less and less common. So there was also the changing execution of notated ornaments. People started to do things like trills in different ways. That was a change of taste. Again, I'll come back to it. I'm going to deal with all of these over the course of the lecture in the order which we have them on this page, so that the changes as they happened over time. In the late 19th, early 20th century, there's a gradual replacement of varied ornamental vibrato with continuous vibrato. People start to use what I actually prefer to call trembling effects in string playing, in singing, because they probably weren't very like modern vibrato. But people started to use more and more of these trembling effects than they had done in Beethoven's lifetime. There was a decreasing employment of arpeggiation and asynchrony as an expressive resource in piano playing, and an increasing vertical synchrony in ensemble. I mean, those of you who have made any recordings will know how worried the recording engineer gets if you're not absolutely perfectly together. That wasn't normal until really quite late in the 19th, and even we can hear it on early recordings. Then there's the beginning of gradually changing attitudes towards articulation. What do staccato marks mean? What do slurs imply? These things are changing over the later part of the 19th century and into the 20th. And then in the early to the mid-20th century, we have the prohibition of unnotated arpeggiation and asynchrony in piano playing. It gradually gets less and then finally disappears. Modern pianists do not do it unless it's notated in the text. Then there's the gradual abandonment of significant agogic accentuation and rhythmic flexibility. People up to the middle of the 20th century, many of them were still using much more flexible treatment of the notated rhythms than we do today. Then there's the gradual replacement of unnotated tempo flexibility by a virtually constant pulse. That's happened in my own lifetime. When I was young, people were doing much more tempo flexibility in performance than they do now. And then there was a gradual marginalization of portamento, sliding from one note to another in singing and string playing, and even it had happened in wind playing. By the mid-20th century, that has disappeared. completely, except in popular music forms. I mean, in jazz, the wind players still do it. So we have all of these elements, and I'm going to try and deal with them in turn. Here's tempo, absolute tempo. Let's have a look at some of the evidence for tempos in Beethoven. I take my examples from some of the violin sonatas. Beethoven did not provide metronome marks for the violin sonatas. He provided them for the symphonies, the string quartets, and quite a few other works. And from this, we have a very clear idea of what he meant by his designations, which were not metronome marks. We have three of them, basically. We have the tempo term in Italian, like allegro con brio here, the meter, the C, 4/4, if we want to call it that, and the types of notes used in the piece. So if you'd used, if the fastest notes were 8th notes, it would be different than if the fastest notes are 16th notes or 32nd notes. Here, I want to compare some allegro con brios in C, meter, with 16th notes. Beethoven gave a couple of interesting markings. The Second Symphony, first movement, at 100 for the half note, and the string quartet, opus 95, number 1, at 92 for the half note. What's the difference for that? They both have 16th notes, but the symphony has fewer complex 16th notes than the quartet. Therefore, the quartet has to go a little bit slower to get the same effect of allegro con brio. Now look at the metronome marks given by 19th century and early 20th century people for the sonata, opus 12, number 1, first movement. Moscheles, who knew Beethoven very well and worked with him quite closely, gives us 92 for the half note. Czerny, Vortrag is his 1846 treatise, Die Kunst des Vortrags. And he also made some editions for various editors. Czerny gives a slightly slower mark of 88. Allard, French editor from the middle of the 19th century, in his 1860s edition, gives a much, much slower metronome mark of quarter note equals 152. Speidel, a German pianist, and Singer, a German violinist. Singer had actually worked, he'd been trained by one of the people who worked with Beethoven, Joseph Böhm, but he gives 76, much slower. And when Kreisler and Rupp recorded it in the 1930s, they played it at about this tempo, 69 to 72. So you can see that over time, these tempos get slower. Possibly Moscheles is very close to what Beethoven would have given. The others are definitely slower and progressively so. Look at the second movement of Opus 12, number 3, an Adagio con molta espressione. Beethoven's metronome marks for similar movements are the Second Symphony introduction at 84, the Fourth Symphony second movement at 84, and the string quartet, which I can't see the number now on the right of my screen, but whatever it is slower because it has 64th notes in it. Again, we see, if you look at the ones over time, you see a gradual decrease of tempos, with a slightly odd one from Czerny in the Simrock edition. He gets faster again, but the later ones much, much slower for these slow movements. Opus 23 is an interesting one, the first movement, the Presto 6/8. Beethoven gave just one marking for an exactly equivalent Presto 6/8, which has only got 8th notes in it. And that is 96 for the dotted half note, incredibly fast. For one with 16th notes, he gives a much slower marking, of course, because you need more time for the 16th notes. But these editions, even though this has only 8th notes, all give much slower marks than I'm sure Beethoven would have given. The first movement of the famous Spring Sonata has got slower and slower over time as well, because it's become much more lyrical in the way people perform it. Here you can see, I won't go through them in detail, you can see them on the screen, the Beethoven markings for similar movements, allegros in C meter with 16th notes, and then all of the ones that come here are slower and slower over time. The Violin Sonata, opus 96, is another very good instance. I won't linger on this one. You can see it later if you want to go back to the recording and have a look at them. But there's some very fascinating discrepancies here with tempo. Fundamentally, everything gets slower over time. Then we have the tempo flexibility. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach in the middle of the 18th century tells us about two kinds of tempo flexibility. So he says certain purposeful violations of the beat are often exceptionally beautiful. However, a distinction in their use must be observed in solo performance and ensemble made up of only a few understanding players, so good musicians. Manipulations are permissible which affect the tempo itself. So you can actually get faster, get slower. Here, the group will be less apt to go astray than to be attentive and to adopt change. So they listen to each other carefully and they follow the tempo fluctuations of whoever is leading the ensemble. In a larger ensemble, however, which is made up of players of mixed ability, motley players, the manipulations of the tempo must be addressed to the bar alone without touching on the broader pace. The classic tempo rubato, in which a soloist may give greater length to one note and hurry other notes so that it keeps in time with the fundamental tempo. Carl Czerny talks about this in his 1839 piano school. And you must remember, Czerny was one of Beethoven's only two important pupils. Czerny studied with Beethoven for several years when he was a boy, essentially, and remained in close contact with Beethoven throughout his life. Now we come to the third and most important means of performance style, the numerous changes to the prescribed tempo through rallentando and accelerando. Now he's already explained, as he says in paragraph 2, that every piece must be played strictly in time at the composer's prescribed tempo. But without damaging this, there are very often in almost every line individual notes or passages where a small, and he says here, often hardly noticeable holding back or acceleration is necessary. Now, what he considered to be hardly noticeable might seem very noticeable to us because the whole context of this is different. And then to combine this flexibility with firm timekeeping in a tasteful manner is the great art of the good player and can only be acquired through developing cultivated feeling, diligent, attentive practice, and listening. This is the most important thing. Listening to good artists on all instruments, but especially great singers. Of course, we can't do that. We can't hear those people, though we can hear early recordings of people who were born in the first half of the 19th century, which can give us some hint of what was going on at this time. And then he tells us something which is very important. Not only every piece of music, but every single passage either expresses some particular sensation or at least allows one to put this into the performance. So it's about the expressiveness of music. We kind of lost this in the 20th century. Remarks by people like Stravinsky about music expresses nothing have had an influence. And we've kind of lost the idea that all music is telling us a story. So Czerny then gives us a list of places where you might push the tempo forward. And it's all about expressing feeling here. You can see from that list. And then he tells us that accelerando is required in an ascending phrase and implies passion and agitation, and notes that the word calando and smorzando are used for ritornello. Now, added ornamentation is a really interesting and controversial issue as far as Beethoven is concerned. Did he expect this? Did he, for instance, expect that when you play a sonata form movement and repeat the exposition, that you play it exactly the same? Or do you add some ornamentation? Well, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, in the middle of the 18th century, just 10 years before Beethoven died, and we must remember that when Czerny became Beethoven's piano pupil, the first thing Beethoven said was he must get Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's Versuch, his treatise on keyboard playing. So Beethoven knew that very well. Here in the introduction to his sonatas with varied reprises, with varied repeats, he says, well, you have the French here as well. When we make a repeat nowadays and reproduce something, it is indispensable to make changes in it. This is expected of all who are charged with the execution of work. So for Bach in the middle of the 18th century, it was absolutely necessary to ornament something when it came back, not to play it the same. This practice still goes on into the 19th century. Here we have Czerny's edition again of Müller's Fortepiano Schule. And he says that the teacher must help the performer to know how to decorate one and the same melodic passage, especially when it is frequently repeated, with free ornamentation, or to alter it in various ways. partly to avoid monotony, partly in this manner to make the passage pleasanter and more expressive for the listener. So that's the text is from the original version of Müller's treatise, but Czerny changed very, very many things in this treatise. The fact that he doesn't change this suggests that he must have agreed with it at that point in 1830. This is important because Czerny's views changed over time. When we come to his piano school of the fourth volume of 1846, where he talks about performing Beethoven, he says, in the performance of his works and of all classical authors, the player ought absolutely not to permit himself any change to the composition, any addition, any abbreviation. Now, why does Czerny tell us this? Well, he'd had a pretty bad experience with Beethoven over the piano part of the Opus 16 quintet with wind instruments. He'd given a performance in 1812 in which he made many, many changes to the piano part, and Beethoven was rather cross with him. Of course, that's now been taken to mean that Beethoven didn't approve of changes. However, Beethoven did approve of some of the changes he made, but not all of them. We actually have an account of this from someone who knew Czerny. So it isn't true to say that Beethoven disapproved of all changes. He had disapproved of some changes. And what did Czerny himself do in Beethoven? Here we have the Kreutzer Sonata, of which Czerny made two arrangements, one for solo piano of the second movement and one for piano duet of the whole sonata. We see the Stichvorlage and the first edition here of this passage completely unornamented. But in Czerny's version, in the solo piano version, you can see the ornaments and you can see similar ornaments, but slightly differently notated in the piano duet arrangement. These arrangements were made in Beethoven's lifetime. And because Czerny was constantly in touch with Beethoven and on very friendly relationships, it does suggest to me that he didn't think Beethoven would disapprove of these additions. Here we have him doing what is talked about in that Müller treatise, which he edited in 1830, varied repetition. So when this passage comes the first time and the second time exactly the same, we see the two versions in Czerny. The first time it's without ornaments, the second time it has some ornaments. Both in both editions very similar. And then we have the famous Fermata, the beginning of the first movement of the Kreutzer Sonata, which in the edition, you can see here in the Stichvorlage, how it's been modified a little bit. Beethoven's added it. In the original manuscript, the fragmentary manuscript that survives, which we probably think that Beethoven played from in the first performance, neither of the fermatas, for the violin and the piano at the beginning there, and for the piano on the next page, have any ornamentation. So whatever he did in that performance was improvised. We know that the violinist who played it with him in the first performance, Bridgetower, actually made an ornamentation of the first fermata, which doesn't appear in the edition, but Beethoven approved of it. And you can see here, he left a note in his copy of the sonata to say that Beethoven jumped up and embraced me, saying, "Noch einmal, mein lieber Bursch," once again, my dear boy, then held open the pedal so that it would resonate while he made the ornamentation of the fermata. And there's another fermata in the sonata, which is very interesting, in the Andante, near towards the end of the second movement of this sonata. And when we look at the first edition, we see a pair of fermatas. If we look at Czerny's arrangements, here's the first one, the slow movement arranged in 1823. We find not only does he change the musical text before the fermata, this is very interesting too, because those of you who know anything about old notation will understand that his notation there of the upbeats is a notation indicating portamento in singing and in string playing, sliding. And then he ornaments the fermata with a cadenza. In 1825, he does the same thing in his piano duet arrangement, makes a completely different cadenza. In other words, the cadenza shouldn't always be the same. It should be improvised. The fact that he does this in Beethoven's lifetime makes me pretty certain that Beethoven expected a cadenza in this fermata. The Kreutzer Sonata, of course, is a special case because he calls it almost a concerto. And so in places like this, in Opus 96, which everybody repeats exactly, one might put some schneller mordents on some of these places where we have these hairpins when you repeat each of those sections. Probably that's kind of ornamentation, very simple accenting or connecting ornaments, so trills, mordents, or turns would be acceptable to Beethoven, perhaps not something too elaborate. Then there's the question of how the trills were meant to be played. Beethoven's notation is very unhelpful in many cases. He sometimes writes in the little turn at the end, but normally he doesn't do it unless it happens to have an accidental in it. If he hasn't done it, the question is, does he expect it? And does he expect you to begin your trill on the note or above the note? These are small issues in many ways, except, for instance, in the last example here, the violin sonata opus 96, where this particular figure plays a really important part in the piece. So if you don't play that in the way Beethoven expected, you are definitely not being faithful to what he wanted. Again, let's look at these treatises. We have the original edition of Müller's Klavierschule from 1804, and we see he's quite certain that its execution always begins with the higher of two notes. This is all well into Beethoven's lifetime. There's no reason, in fact, I can't present all the evidence here, but if you want to look at my new edition of the Beethoven Violin Sonatas, you'll find much more information. But there's a huge amount of evidence that Beethoven would have expected mostly trills to begin with the upper note. In Czerny's arrangement, he still says the rule is normally to begin its execution with the higher of two auxiliaries. So Czerny, who had studied with Beethoven really intensively, still tells us in 1830 that you begin the trills from above most of the time. It can begin from below and occasionally with the addition of an even lower note. So there are possibilities to do other things because it's an ornament, and all ornaments are, of course, flexible. But when we get to 1839, we find Czerny saying something quite different. Now he says the trill can begin in three ways, with the main note. This happens if the trill is preceded either by no note or by one that is different from the main note, therefore on another key. So now he's telling us that the normal way to play a trill is from the main note. This is what Hummel had already said in his 1828 treatise. The other ways are you begin with the upper note, of course, if the note preceding the trill is the same. Most people don't do that nowadays either, but that's very clear. Everybody still agreed with that. Or you can begin from the note below, though mostly only if the composer has marked it. I suspect, in fact, they were very free about doing trills. But now then, if we look at the question of the end of the trill, and he says, since the trill is only rounded off and completed by the turn, it is, according to our present taste, required, and should also be used where the composer fails to notate it. He gives a couple of places where that's not the case, like in these chains of trills as well. But if we go back to other sources about the trill endings, we find everybody at this period is agreed that there is always a turn at the end of the trill. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, this man writing the cello school, Alexander, a trill must always fall at the end of a turn must always fall at the end of a trill, whether it's marked or not. Finally, two notes are added, which are a necessary part of this ornament. And every real trill, Hummel tells us, must have a turn, even if it's not notated. And Czerny in 1839 still agrees, although these final notes are usually added, they also have to be added where this is not the case. So we have contradictions about the beginning of the trill, but absolute agreement about the turn at the end. Now let's again look at Czerny's arrangements from the 1820s. Here we see him adding the upper note in the bottom example. Even when it's come up from the octave below, he actually begins the trill, notates it. In these examples here, we can see from the fingering in the 1822 arrangement that all those trills are to begin from the upper note. And of course, all of them have turns. In these examples, he doesn't always mark the turns, but it's perfectly clear that he expects them. And he does mark fingering, which shows these trills beginning almost all from the note above. There are one or two exceptions for reasons connected with either technical things or the note that precedes the trill. I won't linger because, again, you can always go back to this and look at it if you want, and even pause the recording, I guess. Again, we see some more examples of the same kinds of things. He's quite casual sometimes about how he does it, but it's clear. So therefore, this sonata, Opus 96, well, a lot of the early editions of it still recognize that the turn must be there at the end of the trill, but they tell us nothing about the beginning of the trill. You can see these two from Friedrich Hermann, who was born in 1828, from Friedrich Grützmacher, who was born in 1832. They say quite clearly that you have a turn. But Edmund Singer, who was born in 1831, tells us that all the trills in this movement are to be played without a turn, gives the instruction. And Leopold Auer, born in 1845, tells us, with his example here, that the trill begins on the main note and doesn't have a turn. There was a difference of opinion. Why is the difference of opinion? One thing is the power of Beethoven's reputation and the growing belief that if you stuck to the notation as exactly as it was written, you were doing what the composer wanted. So because Beethoven gave no beginning to the trill and no end to the trill, they want to play it exactly as it stands. Joseph Joachim, perhaps the most important German violinist of the time, is in no doubt that the trill must have a turn. This is an example from his Violinschule of 1905. But by that time, most people were not doing the turn. The beginning, well, Leopold Mozart had told us that if a passage begins with a trill, the appoggiatura will hardly be heard, and in such cases nothing more than a strong initiation. It's kind of like an accentuation, an accent on the trill. But he's definite about them always beginning from the note above. And we can see that Czerny does that still in the 1830s, but afterwards not. Vibrato. Well, this was something that was changing a lot in Beethoven's lifetime. Just before Beethoven's violin sonatas start to be written, we have Galeazzi telling us that the tremolo, the vibrato, should be entirely banned from music by anyone equipped with good taste. Well, that means people were doing it. And we know Leopold Mozart tells us there were people who tremble as if they had a palsy on every note. Here we have a treatise published in Vienna in 1806, which is very clear, tells us how we to do the vibrato, go backwards and forwards with the finger, move very slowly on the soft part of the note, but on the louder part, move a little faster. That doesn't sound like a modern vibrato, which is usually pretty fast. But they would do it particularly on notes which had these symbols with them. Then we have some very interesting information from some cello treatises. Romberg, who was well connected with Beethoven, 3 years older than Beethoven, tells us when he writes his cello method towards the end of his life that in former times no one could sustain a sound, however short, without constantly trembling with the finger, and it became truly wretched music. Then he tells us, rarely introduced and performed with much power of bow, it gives the note fire and life, but it must be done only at the beginning of the note and not sustained throughout its duration. So it's a very different attitude, which is happening during Beethoven's lifetime. Dotzauer also tells us it's an old ornament that ought nevertheless not to be wholly neglected, introduced infrequently and in the right places, which is a matter of good taste. And he also tells us in another method, this ornament even has advantage over the tremolo that results from the bow, especially when the latter is the result of nervousness. I expect all of you string players have suffered occasionally from that. Well, so there were all sorts of strange trembling effects going on, but they probably weren't very like modern vibrato. Here we have another treatise published in Vienna in Beethoven's lifetime, 1811, by Blumenthal, the Violinschule. And he tells us about bow vibrato. He gives you these examples and tells you how you can change the pressure of the bow to make a trembling effect. He never mentions left hand vibrato at all. Johann Friedrich Schubert, writing his Singschule in 1804, he was both a singer and a violinist. And he tells us that this bebo, vibrato, if you like, or trembling effect, was once considered beautiful, but is now never heard from a tasteful singer. We should tell that to all your singer friends. Everyone who has a cultivated ear will understand that if it is often heard, this ornament will arouse disgust. But there are still violinists who use it on every note that is long enough. I would only allow violinists to use a bebo very rarely on a long isolated note. The singer, never. He can give his sustained note more nuance and variety than the violinist. And then he tells us in a footnote, this is certain that among 10 connoisseurs and experts, there are perhaps not 2 who would give unqualified approval. So 1804, it's increasingly the case that people are stopping doing it all the time, or doing it much. But in any case, what they were doing would not have sounded like a modern vibrato. By the time that Spohr writes his Violinschule in 1833, he's very clear about how infrequently one should use it. It's Rode concerto here, which he marks with a harmonic for the first note, of course, a note that you can't play vibrato on, forte harmonic. And these squiggly lines indicate various kinds of vibrato that he expects you to use on some notes. The 1803 Paris Conservatoire method by Bayeux, Roeder, Kreutzer didn't mention left-hand vibrato at all, only bow vibrato. And we can see from these editions of the Kreutzer Sonata from the 19th century how infrequently even French violinists who were beginning to use more vibrato expected the vibrato to be used in this music because of all these harmonics and open strings that we see in the music. Edmund Singer, German violinist, you see using many of the same things. The harmonics and the open strings were characteristic of all these editions. Here we have it again, Allah, and there in the on the A harmonic again, open string on a long note. And more examples here, open strings, harmonics, in places that modern string players would never use them. Even at the end of the 19th century, someone who actually studied in your institution in Brussels, a violinist called Luis Alonso, writes in his Le Virtuose Moderne, so it's really for people who are virtuosos. He tells that, well, the vibrato is a major thing for virtuosos, and he describes 5 kinds. The first one made by putting a finger on the string and then waving another finger in the air as if you were doing a false trill. He says this primitive vibrato is no longer used, only Italian players still do it. Actually, I found an Italian treatise from around 1930, which still tells you to use this method to produce vibrato. Then there's wrist vibrato, which is quite close to what we do nowadays. He says a regular rocking of the hand. This quavering resembles that of street singers and should be avoided, for it tires the audience. Then there's the vibrato of the forearm, presumably probably a combination of wrist and forearm. And he says this arm vibrato is intolerable, a stiff vibrato, comparable to a false chromatic trill. So it sounds out of tune. And if the violinist uses it, you're delighted when the end of the piece comes. Then we have one that he really does like, par sympathie ou attraction, a soft pearl-like superb, but can only be made on notes doubled by open strings or natural harmonics. So you put your finger on one string and then touch another string with different rhythms according to him. He likes that, perfect. And then there's the bow vibrato, which is very elegant. It's little used because you hardly hear it, but it looks good. Then there's the piano playing, arpeggiation and asynchrony. The traditions here are absolutely clear, and they follow on from harpsichord playing in the 18th century. The harpsichord, the fortepiano were played alongside each other, of course, throughout much of the late 18th century. In fact, Stein even made an instrument which has a harpsichord at one end and the fortepiano at the other. So you don't play them in fundamentally a different way, and therefore you continue to use the arpeggiation of chords to make the instrument sing. So Jean-Louis Adam, in his Méthode de piano, tells us in 1804 that in a succession of chords where the upper notes form the melody, it's almost always necessary to arpeggiate chords. Philip Corrie, in writing in England in 1810, tells us that specifically when the words con espressione, con anima dolce are marked, it means that you must use it particularly and often and make it very broad. Kramer, a pianist we know Beethoven admired, writes in his 1812 treatise that chords can be played in two different ways. First, in an abrupt manner, striking all the notes at once, so like we do nowadays, which is done chiefly at the end of a piece or a sentence, a phrase. Secondly, in arpeggio, sounding successively the notes of which the chord is composed. This second manner is the usual way of playing chords. The notes of the chord are played with more or less velocity as the character of the piece requires. So it is a very important expressive resource for pianists. And to think of Beethoven's music played without arpeggiation is to my mind, completely crazy, because he would have done it all the time and he expected it. The problem people have is that sometimes he actually notates it with a wavy line. But he's only notating it there because it's vital that that chord is played with arpeggio, even if you sometimes choose to play other chords without it. And we have wonderful examples. I haven't included it here, but Karl Reinecker playing his own music, in which he has marked some of these. He arpeggiates much, much more than he's actually marked. Hummel tells us that the power of the sound must be produced solely by the speed of the finger. Full chords are, for instance, mostly arpeggiated very quickly and are much more effective than if the notes are struck simultaneously with the same degree of power. So he's talking here about a characteristic of the Viennese fortepiano. And when he says struck very quickly, he's saying that's the normal way to play a chord. You played it more slowly or in all sorts of different ways for expressive purposes. Carl Czerny gives us much more detail. I won't go through this in detail, otherwise I'll run out of time. But he talks about the discretionary use of arpeggiation. Tells us that many players are so accustomed to spreading chords that they're not able to play full chords or even double notes quite firmly together. And then he says, trying to be, if you like, to stop the beginner doing all these things before they really understand what they're doing. He tells you the sorts of places where you should play notes more together. Whether he really means together or just very slightly arpeggiated is another matter. So he tells us various examples. When they're very short, you play them together. When they're not to be played with great force. When they are to be played with great force. But that's interesting because he says completely the opposite of what Hummel said, which was that they might sound more powerful when you play them arpeggiated. And in contrapuntal passages, although arpeggiation is allowed in the places marked with the crosses, but it will be used on all slow and sustained chords that form a melody, and so on, and gives you many more examples. And sometimes he says you can do it incredibly slowly, but of course this is a case where it's written. Right at the end of the 19th century, we still have the notion that these things are meant to be done by the performer. As the composer leaves the artistic application of nuances in tempo and dynamics to the player, in the same way, they expect them to apply additional arpeggiation on chords not specifically indicated with a sign. Some notation even implies it, but we've forgotten about this. The portato notation, the dots under slurs, for many, many early 19th century writers, implied a separation of the notes, leaving a bit late the notes marked with dots under slurs. So this is in Adam's 1804 treatise, and it's also repeated in several other treatises of the time. Ignaz Moscheles, again, associated very much with Beethoven's Vienna, tells us when dots are used with slurs over double notes and chords, these should be struck slightly in the arpeggio manner, giving them the same length of time as a dot under a slur requires. And it gives you a notational example. And then we see some people who knew Beethoven. Cipriani Potti knew Beethoven very well when he stayed in Vienna for a period around 18 months in the period around 1818-19. And here he gives us in his edition of the Kreutzer Sonata rather more arpeggio signs than were provided by Beethoven himself. This is a very, very interesting and revealing example. It's a recording of the second movement of the Opus 28 Piano Sonata by Karl Reinecker. Karl Reinecker was born in 1824. He was born in Beethoven's lifetime. Unfortunately, this is a piano roll recording, and unfortunately, we don't have a copy of the roll which has the pedaling or the dynamics in it. So all we are hearing here is where he plays the notes, but it's very, very revealing. I'll play it for you. Give you a little rest from my talking. We'll play the whole of this movement. So, Reinecke doesn't do anything in that performance. He was 82 when he made that recording, but his piano playing seems to be still pretty good. He doesn't do anything in that recording that is not given in early 19th and late 18th century sources. All of this bending of rhythms, the irregularity of the pulse, the getting faster, getting slower, and the very, very varied spreading of chords is clearly described in historical evidence. Articulation, I'm not going to spend very long on this, but it's an important issue. String playing in particular has changed a great deal since the 19th century. After Paganini, there was a big revolution in string playing, particularly in the Franco-Belgian tradition, much more use of springing bow strokes. Here we have a treatise from Germany in 1887, which says that the bow stick is made to bounce somewhat with each stroke, so the hair doesn't quite leave or slightly leaves the string. The light bow, which is spread particularly from the newer French school, is now an indispensable bow stroke for every violinist. In the old Italian school, particularly in the German up to Louis Spohr, so we're talking about to the 1850s, was employed less. One mostly played the passages that were suitable for this bow stroke with short on-string bowings at the point. Reinhold Jochisch, talking about how you might do things differently than they appear to be in the scores of the classical masters. He's been talking about particularly Mozart here. He says that it would be quite okay to use a bowing which is more likely to fulfill the composer's intentions than his violin playing contemporaries could have done. In an example from Mozart, it was already demonstrated how where light, grace, and sparkling humor predominate in his works, the saltato, the springing bow stroke, which admittedly was not yet known at this master's time, nevertheless is really good to use. Indeed, according to our present day taste, here we have this thing about taste again, is absolutely indispensable. And of course, we know that everybody does this in modern performances of Mozart and indeed Beethoven. And if you look at the 1958 edition of the Neue Mozart Ausgabe, the Kirchensonate introduction by Minos Dunias, who was a pupil of Joachim, in fact, he tells us that, as a background to this, you need to know that at this time they thought that Mozart used two kinds of staccato marks, strokes and dots. We now, none of us really are persuaded that that's the case anymore. It's just that he wrote them rather carelessly at times, and sometimes they look more like strokes and dots. But they believed that he did, and they thought it had a different meaning. The staccato wedge stroke requires a short on-the-string stroke. For the staccato dot, however, regardless of whether in piano or forte, we must use a more or less feathered spiccato, which we definitely cannot dispense with in performing Mozart's string music. So the same, I think, could be said about performing Beethoven. That's how we string players tend to do it today. In piano playing too, people started to play the notes much more short. They began to develop the idea, which is now current, that a staccato mark always means play the note short. It isn't true. Historically, the evidence is overwhelming that staccato marks meant many different things, and how you executed them was nothing to do with what they looked like, but was to do with the musical context in which you found them. This is the really important thing. It's a very difficult thing to grasp, actually, but it's really important. So here he's complaining about how many students have started shortening notes because a lot of the new editions are putting many more staccato marks in as well. In fact, in keyboard playing, a lot of us think that staccato was the normal touch in the 18th century. It's not really true. It was in North Germany, but it wasn't in Italy, for instance. Here we have Niccolo Pascali telling us that the legato is the touch that he teaches for the harpsichord, and it's fit for almost all kinds of passages. Then the staccato is expressed by purposely lifting up the finger sooner than the length of the note requires. But in his opinion, it is to be used seldom and only when a good effect is expected from it. Vincenzo Manfredini, writing in the 1790s, you must play legato, raising your finger from the note, from the key, just as you play the next note and not before. This must be done not only in cantabile playing, but almost always. So for Italians, it was a singing style of playing on the keyboard. For Germans, it was a more detached side. Where did Beethoven sit in all of this? Well, it's really difficult to say, but the Italian influence on Beethoven was certainly very strong. Agogic accentuation and rhythmic flexibility. These are some of the last things to have disappeared in modern practice. They still go on into the 20th century. Inequality is the first one. Leopold Mozart tells us very clearly that the first of two notes in one bow stroke is accented more strongly, also held slightly longer. The first of 2, 3, 4, or even more notes slurred together must at all times be stressed more strongly and sustained a little longer. So he's in no doubt that it is a factor that is inherent in the use of slur on short groups of notes. Karl Klingler tells us at the beginning of the 20th century, people still didn't need to be told this. They were still doing it. But he's writing now, he lived to be in his 90s, and he was born in the 1870s. And he's now writing in the middle of the 20th century, and he says it is often forgotten that with such notes you used these techniques. Let's take an example here from Mozart. We have this passage here with all of these slurred notes. This is a 19th century edition, actually edited by Ferdinand David, but let's listen to how Karl Klingler, who wrote the previous thing, and his quartet play this passage. And here, a very late example, 1929, the Bohemian String Quartet. The second violinist was Dvorak's son-in-law, and the quartet had worked extremely closely with Dvorak himself. So I think we can take this as representing something close to what the composer expected. I think that's enough to give you the idea. So this kind of inequality was a really, really important part of 19th century playing and 18th century playing too. And nowadays we tend to stick much more closely to the exact written note values on the page. It's interesting in this edition, I'm sorry I didn't put the editor, but this is Singer's edition of Beethoven's Opus 96. Remember, he goes back to a tradition going all the way back to Beethoven's Vienna. And he tells us here in this passage that we must play molto tranquillo ed egale. And we find this egale term also in some of Rode's compositions from the early 19th century. In other words, if you really wanted the passage to be played rather strictly in time, you had to indicate it. Now, we heard Reinecke in the middle section of the Beethoven movement playing dotted rhythms as triplet rhythms. Yum tatam, not yum tatam. Very, very definite triplet rhythms he played. Well, if we look at Haydn, we can see the same notation here, for instance, in a string quartet, clearly being used as a substitute for our modern unequal triplet rhythm, so 2 and 1. They didn't actually use that notation at all in Beethoven's lifetime. Here we have an example of another Haydn string quartet. And we have examples here, which make it absolutely clear that the notation of a dotted eighth note followed by a 16th note really means a triplet. This is a double stopping in a cello part. And Schubert, of course, uses it like this in Die Winterreise. Beethoven almost certainly meant it in this passage, in the string quartet opus 59, number 2. It would be unlikely that he meant the A sharp to come in different places between the two violins. And here in the Archduke piano trio, we can see him struggling to find a notation where you have triplets. He certainly doesn't intend the cello to be playing a different rhythm from the violin or the piano. There'll be an assimilation of that 16th note to the 8th note of the triplet. So in passages like this, in the Violin Sonata opus 24, final movement, with the piano playing constantly triplets, it's almost certain that Beethoven expected the dotted rhythms to be essentially triplet rhythms. Now, of course, since we've heard some of these early recordings and we've read some of the information about bending rhythms, it doesn't mean that it's strict, but it means it's fundamentally intended to stand for a triplet rhythm. Yeah, another example from Opus 96, where it's almost certain that the written rhythms are meant to represent triplets. And here's a questionable example. Is the cello here meant to be with the last note of the triplets in the piano, or is it meant to be afterwards and leaving the dot, making the dot long and leaving the little note late? The performers would have to have decided that. Beethoven doesn't really tell us, because overdotting was normal. One always plays dot somewhat late, Leopold Mozart tells us. Also with figures where you have two fast ones following a dotted note. And if you think back to the example I played you of the Klingler string quartet in 1910, they were overdotting all of those figures. They always left the little notes later than the dotted note. Again, Johann Friedrich Schubert telling us the same thing. And here we have Franz Schubert in his operas using strange notation. He notates the voice parts differently from the wind parts, from the orchestral parts. Here we can see he's notated double dots in the orchestral parts, but has single dots in the singers' parts when they're singing along with the instruments. And there with the solo singer and the cellos, we find different notation in the orchestra than in the singers. Well, the singers did everything by instinct, so you didn't need to notate it. They were obviously going to do that anyway. By the 1820s, some people are saying, well, if the composer writes in a very correct style, you should play it exactly as it's written. So there's already a change beginning here towards the notation being paramount, but it's uncertain. But you might think Wagner writes very correctly, but here it's quite clear that he doesn't, because at this passage in the rehearsals, he stopped the orchestra and said, hold the 8th note with the dot longer. The 16th can then be somewhat shorter. So he's telling them to overdot. Tempo flexibility, tempo rubato. Well, I've already given you that example, so we'll cut that one. And I've given you this one. Sorry, repeating those things. Well, so we know about this. What was also fascinating about the recording by Reinecke and the Klingler string quartet, only a very short number of years later, is the degree of tempo and rhythmic flexibility in them. It's a tradition that they had inherited. They might not have been doing it quite the same as it would have been done in Beethoven's Vienna, but it was of the same kind. Portamento. Here we have a melody by Mestrino from one of his violin concertos, 1787. Mestrino is an interesting figure. He worked with Haydn in Esterházy for 5 years in the early 1780s. It's about the time Haydn started writing portamento fingerings in his Opus 33 string quartets. How did Mestrino play this passage? Well, we know from an ear witness how he played it. Michel Waldemar, who also claims to have had lessons from Mestrino, tells us that this is how he played it. He marks it with quarter tones to show us the slides between all of these intervals. It was a new expressive way of playing. Domenico Corri, writing about singing, it's the perfection of vocal music. It consists in the swell and dying of the voice, the sliding and blending one note into another with delicacy and expression. You still heard the Klingler quartet doing it. It went on until the middle of the 20th century. I can still remember when I was young, many violinists were still sliding quite a lot. Hardly happens at all now. Doesn't happen so much with singing either. Did Beethoven like it? Was it something Beethoven wanted? Well, Cipriani Potter, who spent quite a lot of time with Beethoven and had many conversations with him, reports to us in an article written shortly after Beethoven's death in 1832 that he talks about those slidings upon one string, which imports so beautiful and spiritual a character to his chamber music. And he tells us that actually one of the things that convinced Beethoven of the beauty of portamento was the playing of the great double bass player, Dragonetti, who played his Opus 5 cello sonatas with him in the 1790s, at pitch, apparently, and so beautifully that Beethoven embraced both him and his double bass. We also know from a comment in one of Beethoven's conversation books written by his nephew, Karl, at that time a boy. And he says, what I particularly noticed with Schuppanzig, remember Schuppanzig was the violinist Beethoven worked with most consistently right through his life, and who played his quartets with the famous Razumovsky ensemble. What I particularly noticed with Schuppanzig is that he slides with one finger on the string from one note to another. When, for example, he plays these notes, one hears the intervening notes connected quickly like an unclear scale. Is that right? We don't know what Beethoven replied, but since he'd worked so closely for so long with Schuppanzig, he must have, and since he told Potter that he likes portamento, then it's quite clear that he did approve of what Schuppanzig was doing. We can see from these fingerings in 19th century editions just how often portamento was expected. This passage here almost certainly was calculated by Beethoven for portamento because he wrote the sonata for Roder to play, Pierre Roder, whose use of portamento was famous. Many other passages in the sonatas here with 19th century fingerings showing clear sliding. Now, just finished with a kind of statement here that all of these aspects of beautiful performance, so different from late 20th, 21st century mainstream practice, were part of Beethoven's sound world. We can't ever clearly know how the finest musicians of his time would have employed them, but to perform his music without using them at all is certainly unfaithful to his intentions and expectations. The text is not enough. Performing his works with scrupulous observance of the score, as it's conventionally understood today, is contrary to the meaning of Beethoven's notation, which presupposes many contemporary practices that could not be precisely notated. Close adherence to the text may satisfy some, though not all, early 19th century requirements for a merely correct performance, richtige Vortrag, but it certainly won't create one that Beethoven could have regarded as beautiful, schöne Vortrag. Thank you. So I'm very happy to take any questions or discussion. You need to put your microphone on. Shh. I can't hear. I can't hear you. No. Maybe somebody else should try talking and see if it works. Maybe Olivia should just try to speak to me.
I try talking.
Oh,
do you hear
yes,
me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Tu veux venir ici, pour poser les questions?
Maybe I can hear you now.
Yeah, we change place,
Okay.
like that, but yes. My name is not according with my picture. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Brown. It was really interesting, and particularly the things between the interpretation, historical interpretation in the performing instruments, and how to perform some part of the notation in the book. That's for me quite interesting for the early music department in your conservatory. I have some questions also, but maybe before we can ask some participants for questions. that I can just inform you. Sir Claire, do you have any questions about this presentation or what, or not?
Nice to meet you virtually. No, I was just wondering, because I asked myself a few times listening to the piano rolls. Even for Debussy, I remember one time I was trying to study Soirée dans Grenade. And at some point, for me, piano rolls, I always doubt a little bit about the fine timing of, you could say, repeated notes or things like this. I'm not sure. I'm just asking myself, because I know the difficulties they have now. I've been in the Pianola Museum in Amsterdam, seeing the guys working on this instrument when they have to play the rolls. And it's not always on technical side, it's not always really easy to have the mechanic of the piano used by the system, who would be really perfectly regulated. So it's some moments I found it really, really interesting to hear it with the arpeggios, and so you can feel when the pianist plays on the roll, where it's his decision. But sometimes I doubt a little bit about the timing of repeated note, for instance.
Yeah, I'm not a great expert on piano rolls, but all the people that I've spoken to who are assure me that the one thing that is definitely correct on the piano rolls is the timing. That not necessarily if you play it on a piano, because many of the pianos are not regulated well enough. But if you play it on a disc clavier, as I think that recording was done, exactly what was intended from the timing. There's a good video by Sebastian Bausch, which you probably can find online. I think it's provided by La Nouvelle Athènes, which is an organization based in Paris. And he explains it all in really great and interesting detail. He's a real expert on this. And he also recreates a performance of the Reinecke recording of that Beethoven. He's a fine pianist himself. So you may find that very interesting.
Thank you.
I have a question of one of our violin professors, Shirley Loeb. She said that it was really interesting for the violin students to have some notations for the fingers in the score. And she asking if you have any advices for the student in conservatory now to have a historical performance, and some advices to have to go to this way.
Yeah, I mean, do you mean from a technical point of view or from the point of view of historical documentation?
Maybe both, and also about to listen to something that it will be most close of the historical performance.
Okay, sure, fine. Well, I mean, from the historical evidence point of view, I can really only say that I've provided as much as I possibly can in my edition of the Beethoven Violin Sonatas, which has just come out in September. I've provided a violin part which is bowed and fingered according to 19th century practices. So that would provide a text for people to experiment with. How to execute particularly the portamento, which of course we're not trained to do in modern practice at all. And it's a very, very complex and subtle art. There's several recordings I would think are worth listening to from that point of view. Some of the Klingler recordings, certainly, but most importantly, Joachim, his recording particularly of his romance, and even more importantly, I think, are the recordings by Marie Soldat, who was a Joachim pupil. She was very, very close to Brahms. She played his sonatas with him, and she was the first woman to perform the violin concerto as well. And she made some wonderful recordings around 1920. Very revealing from the point of view of Beethoven performance are two of them. One is the slow movement of Spohr's Ninth Concerto, which he had originally studied with a pupil of Spohr, who had been studying with Spohr in 1820. So there's a really interesting line back to Spohr, who of course knew Beethoven well too, and played in Vienna many times in Beethoven's lifetime. In fact, he took part in the first performance of the Seventh Symphony. And there's also a recording of the Beethoven Romance in F by her, which is quite interesting. I think the Spohr is the most interesting and important one, because we know there's a sort of legacy back to the early 19th century with that.
Okay, thank you so much. I have another question that here from Margot Sladen. Yeah, it's a general question. They ask you, is Beethoven used the notation of bell and confortance by interpretation and bell? Right, correct and beautiful. Is it written on the scores or something? No. Oh, do we have some writing report of Beethoven about these both terms, bell and correct?
No, we don't have Beethoven talking about them. We only have his pupil Jenny talking about them and other people whom he worked with. He didn't write these sort of things down. I mean, it would be very unlikely that Beethoven would ever have, he might have used them in conversation, but we don't. Okay.
And I had also another question from yesterday, because yesterday we studied the grosse fugue in the quartets.
Oh. Ah,
yeah.
You mean the tied notes?
Yes, we have a question with you with the 18 notes, because they are linked together and not in quarter notes. So maybe I share my screen to see it to the online. No, it's okay. I can do it here. L'animateur a désactivé le partage d'écran par participant. Oh yeah, you are the animator, Professor Bross.
Oh yes, so what do I have to do? I'll give it back to you. I mean, can I give it back to you?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
How do I do that?
Yeah, it would be great.
How do I do that? Do you know?
Wait.
Let's see. No. I don't see how to do it, I'm afraid.
Oh, maybe Olivia.
But I know the passage you mean, and these are a pair of eighth notes which have got a tie.
Yeah, they are tied, but normally they shouldn't. Yeah.
Well, it's very frustrating, because there's an entry in Beethoven's conversation books from Karl Holz, the second violin of the quartet which first played this, and he asks Beethoven what does he mean by it. But Beethoven, of course, told him in words. He didn't write it down. So we don't know. But there are other instances in Beethoven's writing. One of the most obvious ones is the cello sonata opus 69 in the scherzo, tam 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 ta ta tam pum, which you get it in the piano part and the cello part. It's been a bit controversial, but there was a very good paper about it at the Lugano conference a couple of weeks ago, which brought in some new evidence and made it, to my mind, well, I've always thought this anyway, but it made it really clear that the second note is emphasized. It's played with a little extra on the violin, with an extra accent on the bow. It obviously comes from the clavichord Bebu, which Beethoven would have used in his youth when he played the clavichord.
So do you think there will be a difference of interpretation on the expression with tied notes or without tied notes?
Yeah. Czerny tells us in relation to the cello sonata, he says that you do it by using two fingers on the one note, and you repeat the finger halfway through the note. Yeah,
exactly. On the clavichord, it's very more sensible string. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it could be
not
more.
Quite the same.
Yeah, it's very sensitive chord in the clavichord.
Yeah. And of course, he uses it also in one of the late piano sonatas, in the recitative passage. But if you can still get the Lugano conference online, you might be able to find that very good lecture.
Okay, in which year is the Lugano conference?
The one a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it was an online conference, and I think it is still online. I can't remember the name of the person who gave the talk. I'd have to look it up. But
thank you. Great. I have another question from Professor Laub. She asked you, as performance fashions change quite quickly, do you feel in your performing roles now that the feeling of freedom of interpretation has the same impact on historical performance?
No, we can't know what Beethoven's performance sounded like. We can't know what Czerny sounded like in 1820 and what he sounded like in 1840. It probably was different. But we can see that what people are doing on those early recordings are actually exactly what is described. Words can never really tell us what it sounds like, but they are of the same kind. Yeah, we can't say whether they are exactly performed in the same way, but they are the things that are described. You know, the inequality of the notes, the changing of tempo, the spreading of chords, the sliding of the fingers, all of these things are there in 18th and 19th, early 19th century historical documents. And they were obviously part of a tradition. Traditions always change, so probably it wasn't quite like Reinecke did it or quite like Joachim did it, but it was similar, much, much more similar than it is to the way that we do it conventionally, even on period instruments. I mean, to me, I'm always surprised that on period instruments, people are not much more adventurous about departing from the notation, because it really is clear that still in the 19th century, notation is only telling you half the story.
Yeah. Thank you. I have another question concerning the interpretation of dotted being executed as triples. This practice could have been made also before Beethoven's time.
Yes, absolutely. They did not have the modern triplet notation of a quarter note followed by an eighth note with a three over the top. They just didn't have it. It's much later in the 19th century that it appears. And even when it does appear, I think a lot of composers still went on using the dotted notation. Even Grieg. We have a recording of his Humoresca that he made in 1903. And in precisely one of these passages where he's first of all had triplets and then he has these dotted rhythms, he plays the dotted rhythms exactly as triplets, just as Reinecke did in that recording.
Yeah, also in organ score from Bach in the 18th century, we have also that dot quarter notes. That is, they don't be vertically executed in the same time with the triples notes. So maybe also it's a tradition of a writing or something from the Baroque music.
Yeah, I think so. I think they just didn't think it was necessary because rhythms were always much more flexible than they are on the page. They didn't think it necessary to invent a precise way of doing it. Everybody understood that the context was everything. So in some contexts, you would make them into triplets. In others, you'd make them into over-dotted figures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We have a wonderful recording by Adelina Patti of an aria from Bellini's La Sonnambula, A non credea, where the accompaniment is throughout in triplets, and she assimilates everything to the triplets of the accompaniment. I think it was a natural thing for the performers to do when they listened. They fitted it together. Because remember that in chamber music, you never saw a score. A piano trio only had the piano part. A violin sonata had only the piano part, not the violin part in it or the other string parts. And so the performers, and they didn't have rehearsal letters and they didn't have bar numbers. So they used their ears a great deal more than we do.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Professor Brown. You have a very, very grateful, and we express our gratitude from the director of the Conservatoire of Brussels, for our team, our organization committee, the teachers, the students. They are all very happy and really happy to having you this morning. It's a very big pleasure for us, and having you this morning for the colloque of Beethoven.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a last question I see online from the Laube violin teacher. Are there documents of the use of metronome other than the tempo marking?
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot of information that has been written about quite a bit, and some of the treatises talk about the use of the metronome as well. Yeah. yeah, I'm very pleased to have been able to be here, and I'm really just sorry that I can't be with you physically in Brussels.
Maybe next time we will invite you for some conferences in Brussels. Yeah, we will be very pleased to welcome you here. Yeah.
Well, it would be so nice to work directly with students, because that's one of the things that I particularly.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you very much. Do you have something for?
Pardon me, Salvatore. I just had one question for Mr. Brown. I raised the hand earlier, but no one saw me. I always wonder where should I stand for historical practice. I mean that if we play nowadays Beethoven on pianoforte in 430 with all you said just before, like inequality, less metric. If we play Beethoven as we should play it, I will lose a quarter of the audience, and one other quarter will be deceived by the performance. So should I play for the audience or for the composer? Does Beethoven say something about adapting his music to the people that listen, or should he play the same whenever someone hears it or not?
That's an aesthetic choice in the end, and it's also a question of courage. If you believe that this is how the music should be played, then that's how you should play it. I do have this discussion with my students in Vienna all the time, because they say, well, this is great. Wow, it's so exciting to do this. Oh, but if I do it, my teacher will tell me I'm not allowed to. Or if I do it like this, I'll never get into a competition, or I'll never get an orchestral job. So yeah, you have to make your own decisions about that. Things do change. Things are changing. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen changes in performance, very obvious changes in performance. The question is, in what direction do they go? You're young, you're part of the rising generation of performers, and it's up to you to create something new. Something old and something new.
Okay, thank you. I think it's finished for the questions. I just remember you that at 1:30 there is a conference for about the metronome. Indeed. So, if I may just remember it. So now we will close the YouTube channel, and we will continue with what? Okay, thank you. We will still be online with Mr. Brown now in Zoom, and we close the YouTube session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I beg your pardon. I've got a question, if it's possible, if we're not online anymore.
Yeah, sure.
Hello, thank you very much for your conference. It's actually in the continuation of the previous question. Well, I know it's a bit awkward to ask, but do you picture yourself a performance world in 50 years time where everybody would play the music that is written for some instruments on these instruments, and with the tradition